Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Phoenix watching the stars blur past as they traveled through hyperspace. The ship hummed quietly around him as his crew worked at their stations. Jake had been exploring space for 15 years, but he had never received a message like the one that came from Earth Command 3 days ago. The communication had been marked with the highest priority codes Jake had ever seen. Admiral Susan Clark herself had appeared on the screen looking more serious than Jake had ever witnessed. She told him that humanity had received its first official contact from something called the Galactic Council. This council claimed to rule the entire galaxy, and they wanted to meet with human representatives immediately. Jake remembered how his hands had trembled slightly as he read the full message. The council consisted of 12 different alien species that had been in power for over 10,000 years. They had technology that made human science look like stone tools. They controlled thousands of star systems and commanded fleets of ships that could destroy entire planets. The message from the council was simple but frightening. Humanity had been expanding into space without permission. They had built colonies on 47 different worlds and established military bases in areas the council considered restricted. The humans had never known these areas were off limits. Because no one had ever told them about galactic law, now the council wanted to meet with human leaders to discuss what they called the human problem. Jake was ordered to escort Commander Lisa Bell to the council capital world called Nexus Prime. Lisa was Earth's first ambassador to alien civilizations, though she had never actually met any aliens before. Jake looked over at Lisa, who was studying data files at a nearby console. She was a small woman with brown hair and sharp green eyes. She had spent her entire career preparing for first contact with aliens, but no one had expected it to happen like this. The council's message had not been friendly or welcoming. It sounded more like a summons to Court General Patricia Hayes had briefed them both before they left Earth. She explained that the council's power was beyond human understanding. The Zephyrians could control gravity itself and make objects float or crush them with their minds. The crystalline hive was made up of living crystal beings that could think faster than any human computer. The ancient Vorthan Empire had learned how to manipulate energy on the scale of entire stars. Patricia had made it clear that refusing the council's invitation was not an option. Their combined military forces could turn Earth into burning ash within a matter of days. Humanity's entire space fleet consisted of about 300 ships, while intelligence reports suggested the council commanded over 50,000 vessels. The journey to Nexus Prime would take 2 weeks, even at maximum hyperspace speed. Jake used this time to drill his crew on emergency procedures, while Lisa studied everything humans knew about council politics and alien psychology. The information was limited since humanity had only learned about the council's existence 3 days ago. Jake often found himself staring out at the stars and wondering how humanity had remained ignorant of galactic civilization for so long. Earth had been sending radio signals into space for over a century and had been exploring nearby star systems for 30 years. How had they missed signs of a galaxy-spanning empire? The answer came from the few reports Earth had managed to gather. The council kept primitive species isolated until they reached a certain level of technology and expansion. Humanity had apparently crossed some invisible line when they established their 40th colony. This had triggered automatic monitoring systems that alerted the council to human activities. Lisa often worked late into the ship's night cycle reading reports about other species that had encountered the council. Most had been peacefully integrated into the galactic community after accepting council authority. A few had resisted and had been relocated to different star systems. None had been allowed to continue expanding without council permission. As the days passed, Jake began to understand the weight of their mission. They were not just representing Earth, but the entire human species. Whatever happened at Nexus Prime would determine humanity's future in the galaxy. They might return home as citizens of a galactic empire, or they might not return home at all. On the 10th day of their journey, they detected the first signs of council technology. Strange energy, Readings appeared on their sensors but showed no visible source. Lisa explained that these were probably automated monitoring stations watching their approach. The Council would know everything about their ship and crew before they even arrived. Jake ordered his crew to run full diagnostics on all systems. He wanted the Phoenix to make a good impression even though he knew their technology was primitive, compared to Council standards. The ship was one of humanity's newest exploration vessels, but it would probably seem like a crude metal box to beings who could manipulate gravity and energy. On the 12th day, they received their first direct contact from Council forces. A voice speaking perfect English told them they were now entering Council space and must follow prescribed navigation routes. Jake noticed that his ship's controls had become partially locked. The Council was now guiding their approach, whether Jake wanted it or not. 2 days later, Nexus Prime appeared on their screens. The sight took Jake's breath away. It was not a natural planet, but an artificial world covered in gleaming towers and energy fields. Ships moved around it in patterns too complex for human minds to follow. Some of the vessels were so large they could have carried Earth's entire population. As the Phoenix approached the docking facilities, Jake realized that everything about this world was designed to overwhelm visitors. The scale was impossibly huge, and the technology was clearly far beyond human understanding. This was the seat of power for beings who considered humans to be barely civilized animals. Council ships appeared around them without warning. Jake's sensors could barely detect the vessels, even though they were close enough to touch. These escort ships guided the Phoenix to a docking bay that could have held 50 human vessels. Jake felt very small as they settled onto the landing platform. Lisa straightened her uniform and checked her diplomatic credentials one final time. Jake made sure his sidearm was properly secured, even though he knew it would be useless against Council technology. They were about to meet the rulers of the galaxy, and Jake had the feeling that humanity's future hung in the balance of what happened next. The Council chamber was unlike anything Jake Morrison had ever imagined. The vast dome stretched high above them, made of some kind of crystal that seemed to glow with its own inner light. 12 different platforms held the representatives of the species that ruled the galaxy. Each platform was designed for a different type of being, and the technology that kept them all alive in the same space was beyond human understanding. Ambassador Lisa Bell walked forward with careful, measured steps. Her diplomatic training had prepared her for many situations, but meeting the rulers of the galaxy was not something anyone could truly be ready for. Jake followed 2 steps behind her, wearing his military dress uniform and trying to look confident, despite feeling completely out of place. The being that spoke for the Council was called Hierarch Zexthara, and he belonged to the Vorthan Empire. He was tall and thin, with skin that looked like polished metal, and eyes that glowed with soft blue light. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from everywhere at once and carried the weight of thousands of years of authority. Zexthara began by listing the charges against humanity. The humans had expanded into 47 star systems without requesting permission from the Council. They had established military installations in areas designated as restricted space. They had begun mining operations on worlds that were classified as protected resources. Most seriously, they had begun developing weapons technology without Council supervision. Lisa tried to explain that humanity had no knowledge of galactic law or restricted zones. She pointed out that humans had never encountered any other intelligent species and had assumed the galaxy was empty of civilization. She argued that ignorance of the law should be taken into consideration when determining punishment. The Council was not interested in human excuses. Prime Node 7 of the crystalline hive spoke next. The being looked like a collection of living crystals arranged in a roughly humanoid shape. Its voice sounded like musical chimes, but the words were cold and final. It explained that ignorance was not an acceptable defense under galactic law. Prime Node 7 continued by analyzing human expansion patterns. The Hive had studied human behavior for the past 30 years and determined that humans were aggressive expansionists with little regard for existing order. They reproduced quickly and consumed resources at rates that were considered wasteful by galactic standards. Most concerning was their rapid technological advancement and tendency toward military solutions. Jake felt his anger rising as he listened to the aliens discuss humanity like they were a pest problem to be solved. These beings had watched humans struggle and grow for decades without offering help or guidance. Now they appeared with overwhelming force and demanded submission to laws that humans had never been told existed. The representative from the aquatic collective spoke through a translation device that turned their liquid communications into audible words. They supported the Council's decision by pointing out that humanity's expansion was disrupting carefully balanced ecosystems on several worlds. The humans had introduced invasive species and altered atmospheric compositions without understanding the long-term consequences. Lisa requested permission to present evidence of human civilization and achievements. She had prepared a presentation showing human art, science, and philosophy, hoping to demonstrate that her species deserved respect rather than punishment. Hierarch Zex Thara allowed her 5 minutes to make her case. The presentation showed images of Earth's great cities and monuments. Lisa displayed examples of human music, literature, and scientific discoveries. She talked about human values like freedom, democracy, and individual rights. She explained how humans had overcome war and poverty to build a peaceful, unified world government. The Council listened in silence, but Jake could see they were not impressed. To beings who had mastered gravity manipulation and energy control, human achievements probably looked primitive. To species who had lived for millennia, human civilization was barely worth noticing. When Lisa finished her presentation, Hierarch Zexthara delivered the Council's verdict. Humanity would be relocated to a designated sector of space far from the galactic core. Human colonies outside this sector would be evacuated and the worlds returned to their natural state. Human military forces would be limited to what the Council deemed appropriate for internal security. The relocation sector contained 12 star systems with planets suitable for human habitation. These worlds had basic resources but lacked the rare minerals and energy sources that advanced civilizations required. Humanity would be allowed to develop within this area, but expansion beyond its borders would not be permitted. Lisa asked what would happen to the humans who refused to relocate. Many of the outer colonies were home to people who had spent their entire lives building new societies. These colonists had families and businesses and communities that they would not want to abandon. The answer came from War Commander Thexmore of the Zephyrian Directorate. The alien's form seemed to shift and flow as gravitational fields bent around him. His voice carried the certainty of someone who had never been defeated in battle. Non-compliance would be met with force sufficient to ensure the Council's orders were followed. Thexmore explained that the Council had maintained galactic peace for 10,000 years by ensuring that all species understood their place in the established order. Primitive species that attempted to resist Council authority were taught the consequences of defiance. The lessons were usually permanent. Jake stepped forward despite knowing he had no authority to speak. He looked directly at Hierarch Zexathara and asked if the Council had ever considered that humanity might choose to fight rather than accept relocation. The question caused a stir among the alien representatives, who seemed amused by human boldness. Hierarch Zexathara's response was delivered with what might have been pity. Human military technology was centuries behind Council capabilities. Human ships were slow-crewed and poorly armed compared to the vessels commanded by the galactic powers. A war between humanity and the Council would end in human extinction within weeks. The Hierarch continued by showing holographic displays of Council military forces. Fleets of ships that could destroy planets moved through space faster than human minds could comprehend. Weapons that could turn entire star systems into cosmic dust were demonstrated with casual efficiency. The message was clear that resistance was not just futile, but suicidal. Lisa made one final attempt at negotiation. She asked if humanity could be given time to prepare for the relocation and assistance in moving their populations. She pointed out that 47 colonies contained over 200 million people who would need transportation and support. The Council granted humanity 30 standard days to begin the relocation process. Council ships would arrive at each human colony to supervise the evacuation and ensure compliance with the relocation order. Any delay or resistance would result in immediate military intervention. As the meeting ended, Jake and Lisa were escorted from the chamber by floating drones that hummed with barely contained energy. The aliens had made their position clear and absolute. Humanity had 30 days to surrender their freedom or face destruction. Walking back to their ship, Jake noticed that Lisa's hands were shaking. The weight of representing an entire species had finally hit her, and she realized that she might be returning to Earth with news that would end human civilization as they knew it. The docking bay seemed even larger as they walked across it toward the Phoenix. Jake wondered if this might be the last time humans would walk as free beings in the galaxy. In 30 days, everything would change, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The emergency session of the United Earth government had been running for 18 hours without a break. President Marcus Cole sat at the head of the long table surrounded by the most powerful people on Earth. The weight of making a decision that would determine humanity's future pressed down on everyone in the room like a physical force Admiral. Susan Clark had just finished presenting the military analysis, and the numbers were devastating. Earth's combined space forces consisted of exactly 293 vessels of various sizes. Intelligence estimates suggested the Council commanded over 50,000 ships with technology that outclassed human weapons by hundreds of years. The Admiral's voice was steady, but Jake could see the strain in her eyes as she continued her briefing. Human weapons were based on kinetic projectiles and basic energy beams, while Council forces used gravity manipulation and stellar-scale energy control. A single Council destroyer could probably defeat Earth's entire home fleet without taking significant damage. Dr. Helen Ross stood to present the scientific perspective. She was Earth's leading expert on alien biology and had spent the last week analyzing every piece of data they had about Council species. Her conclusion was that compliance with the relocation order offered humanity's best chance for long-term survival. Dr. Ross explained that the Council had relocated other species in the past and most had adapted well to their new territories. The Grollar Republic had been moved to a different sector 3,000 years ago and had eventually become junior members of the galactic community. The Keth Collective had been relocated twice, and now served as administrators for several Council worlds. However, Colonial Administrator Paul Wright brought a different perspective to the discussion. He had spent the last 2 days receiving messages from the outer colonies, and the response was overwhelmingly negative. The colonists were not interested in abandoning the worlds they had spent decades building. Wright read excerpts from some of the messages that had flooded Earth's communication networks. The governor of New Boston had stated that his people would rather die fighting than surrender their homes. The mining colonies in the Kepler system had voted unanimously to resist any forced evacuation. Even the peaceful agricultural settlements were organizing militia units. The colonists had good reasons for their anger, Wright explained. Many of them were second- or third-generation settlers who had never even seen Earth. Their entire lives were bound up in the worlds they had built from scratch. They had fought hostile environments, dangerous wildlife, and equipment failures to create thriving communities. General Chris Baker presented the military options available to humanity. A conventional war against the Council was clearly impossible to win, but guerrilla warfare might give humans some leverage. The outer colonies were spread across a vast area of space, and occupying all of them would require significant Council resources. Baker had been studying historical examples of asymmetric warfare and believed that human adaptability might give them advantages that other species lacked. Humans were survivors who had evolved in a hostile environment and had a talent for improvisation that more advanced species might not expect. The general also pointed out that other species in the galaxy might support human resistance efforts. The Council ruled through fear and overwhelming force, but that kind of power always created enemies. If humanity could inspire other oppressed species to rebel, it might change the balance of power in the galaxy. President Cole listened to all the arguments before calling for a brief recess. He walked to the window of his office and looked out at the lights of Geneva below. Somewhere out there, 3 billion humans were going about their daily lives unaware that their species faced extinction or slavery. When the session resumed, Cole asked each department head for their final recommendation. Admiral Clark reluctantly supported compliance, arguing that preserving human lives was more important than preserving human freedom. Dr. Ross agreed, stating that cooperation with the Council offered the best path to eventual equality. General Baker and Administrator Wright both argued for resistance. Baker believed that humans had a chance to win if they fought smart, rather than fighting fair. Wright pointed out that surrender would destroy everything that made humans special and turn them into just another Council-client species. The debate continued through the night as Earth's leaders struggled with an impossible choice. They could surrender and preserve human lives but lose human independence. They could fight and probably lose everything but at least die as free beings. There seemed to be no good options available. At dawn, President Cole made his decision. He stood before the assembled leaders and announced that Earth would reject the Council's relocation order. Humanity would prepare to defend their colonies and their freedom regardless of the cost. The president's voice was firm as he explained his reasoning. Freedom was not something that could be given up temporarily and reclaimed later. Once humanity accepted Council authority, they would never be truly independent again. The choice was between certain slavery and possible extinction. Admiral Clark was ordered to coordinate with colonial militias and prepare Earth's defenses for the coming war. General Baker would work with the colonies to develop guerrilla warfare tactics and establish hidden supply bases. Dr. Ross would lead a crash program to analyze Council technology and find potential weaknesses. Administrator Wright was tasked with organizing evacuation routes for non-combatants and establishing safe zones in remote areas of space. The government would also begin reaching out to other species that might be willing to support human resistance efforts. The president concluded by acknowledging that he might be leading humanity to destruction. However, he believed that some things were worth dying for, and freedom was at the top of that list. Humans had not climbed from primitive hunters to spacefaring civilization by accepting defeat as word of Earth's decision spread across human space. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Colonial governments that had been preparing to fight suddenly found themselves coordinating with Earth Command. Independent freighter captains volunteered their ships for military service. Even the pacifist colonies began organizing support. For the war effort on New Boston, Governor Rachel Green called up the colonial militia and began converting civilian facilities into weapons factories. The mining colonies started producing raw materials for military construction. Agricultural worlds began stockpiling food supplies for a prolonged conflict. In the Kepler system, Colonel Sandra Lee organized the asteroid miners into irregular military units. These people knew how to work in hostile environments and handle dangerous equipment. They would make excellent guerrilla fighters if Council forces tried to occupy their territory. Earth's orbital shipyards switched to military production and began working around the clock to build new vessels. The designs were crude compared to Council technology, but humans could build them quickly and in large numbers. Quantity might have to substitute for quality as the deadline approached. Jake Morrison received new orders promoting him to fleet command. He would coordinate defensive operations in the outer colonies, while Admiral Clark handled Earth's protection. It was a massive responsibility for someone who had been an exploration captain just weeks earlier. The Phoenix was refitted with additional weapons and armor before heading back to the frontier. Jake's crew volunteered to stay with him, despite knowing they were probably flying toward their deaths. Human determination was becoming the one resource that exceeded Council estimates. 27 days after receiving the ultimatum, Earth transmitted its official response to the Council. President Cole's message was simple and direct. Humanity rejected the relocation order and would defend their colonies with all available force. The Council could come and take human worlds if they were prepared to pay the price. The galaxy had not seen a major war in over 1,000 years. Advanced species had learned to resolve conflicts through negotiation or had been absorbed into the Council's power structure. No primitive species had ever chosen total war over submission. In 27 hours, the Council's enforcement fleets would begin moving toward human space. Humanity had chosen to fight, and now they would discover whether courage and determination could overcome superior technology. The fate of every human in the galaxy would be decided in the battles to come. The response across human space was unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. Word of Earth's defiant reply to the Council spread through the colonies faster than official communications could travel. Independent freight captains carried the news along with messages of support and offers of help that surprised even the colonial governments on New Boston. The industrial centers worked without stopping, as Governor Rachel Green coordinated the largest military buildup in human history. Factories that had produced farming equipment and mining tools were converted to manufacture weapons and armor. The shipyards that normally built cargo haulers began constructing military vessels using designs that human engineers were creating as they worked. Dr. Kevin Murphy arrived from the Mars shipyards with teams of engineers who had volunteered for what everyone knew was probably a suicide mission. His job was to turn civilian technology into military weapons, using whatever materials the colonies could provide. Mining charges became warheads for improvised missiles. Cargo containers were fitted with guidance systems to create makeshift fighters. The work was dangerous, and several facilities suffered accidents as engineers pushed equipment beyond safe operating limits. However, the colonists accepted the risks because they understood what defeat would mean. Everything they had built would be destroyed, and their children would grow up as subjects of alien masters. Captain Amy Foster commanded the defense forces at Outpost Defiance, which was humanity's furthest colony from Earth. Her fleet consisted of 12 converted cargo ships and one military frigate that had been stationed there for patrol duties. Against Council estimates of 40 attacking vessels, her chances of survival were essentially zero. Foster spent her time drilling her crews on tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare. They would use ramming attacks, suicide charges, and weapons that no honorable military force would consider. The Council expected humans to fight like civilized beings, but humans had learned warfare in the jungles and trenches of Earth. Meanwhile, Ambassador Lisa Bell had been working through diplomatic channels to contact species outside the Council's direct control. Her breakthrough came when she established communication with someone called Vex Kira, who represented the Kalar Resistance. This was a group of species that had been conquered by the Council and forced into client status. Vex Kira explained that the Council's power was not as absolute as it appeared. Several species had been quietly organizing for centuries, waiting for an opportunity to challenge Council authority. However, none had been willing to make the first move because the costs of failure were too high. The Kalar offered to share intelligence about Council military tactics and technology in exchange for humanity's promise to share any successful resistance strategies. They revealed that the Council's greatest weakness was their assumption that all opposition would follow conventional military doctrine. Vex Kira provided detailed information about Council fleet movements and command structures. The enforcement fleets were organized around massive command ships that coordinated thousands of smaller vessels. If these command ships could be destroyed or disabled, entire fleets would lose their effectiveness. More importantly, the Kalar revealed that the Council had not fought a real war in over 1,000 years. Their military forces were designed for intimidation and police actions against primitive species. They had never faced an enemy that was willing to accept massive casualties to achieve victory. Admiral Susan Clark used this intelligence to develop new tactical doctrines that emphasized human advantages. Humans could make decisions quickly without consulting distant command authorities. They were willing to sacrifice individual units to achieve strategic objectives. Most importantly, they could adapt their tactics based on battlefield conditions. General. Chris Baker established training programs that taught colonial militias how to fight as guerrilla forces. The goal was not to defeat council ships in direct combat, but to make occupation so costly that the council would eventually negotiate. Every human colony would become a fortress that required significant resources to capture and hold the training. Emphasized tactics that other species would consider dishonorable or insane. Human fighters would ram enemy ships if their weapons failed. Ground forces would continue fighting even when surrounded and outnumbered. Civilian populations would provide intelligence and support to resistance fighters as the deadline approached. Humanity's scattered colonies began working together in ways that surprised their own governments. Independent traders established supply routes between distant settlements. Scientists shared research data that helped improve weapons and defenses. Even competing corporations began cooperating for the war effort. The asteroid mining stations in the Kepler system became hidden military bases where Colonel Sandra Lee trained irregular forces. The miners knew how to work in dangerous conditions and handle explosive equipment. They would make excellent guerrilla fighters if council forces tried to occupy their territory. Dr. Helen Ross led a team of scientists who were studying every piece of council technology they could find. Most of it was far beyond human understanding, but they identified potential vulnerabilities. Council ships used exotic energy sources that might be disrupted by conventional explosives. Their communication systems operated on frequencies that human electronics could jam. The research team also discovered that council forces relied heavily on automated systems and artificial intelligence. This made their ships efficient, but potentially vulnerable to unexpected tactics. Human unpredictability might be an advantage against opponents who expected logical behavior. Earth's orbital shipyards had tripled their production capacity by converting civilian manufacturing facilities to military use. The new ships were crude compared to council technology, but they could be built quickly using available materials. Human industrial capacity was becoming a strategic weapon in itself. Jake Morrison worked with Admiral Clark to coordinate defensive preparations across human space. His new position as fleet commander gave him authority over military operations in the outer colonies. It was a massive responsibility that he accepted, despite knowing the odds against success. The Phoenix had been refitted with additional weapons and reinforced armor, but it was still just one ship against the might of the Galactic Empire. Jake's crew had volunteered to stay with him even though they understood they were probably flying toward their deaths. Their loyalty represented the kind of human spirit that the Council had not anticipated as the final hours before the deadline ticked away. President Marcus Cole transmitted one last message to the Council. He acknowledged that humanity understood the odds they faced, but reaffirmed their decision to fight for freedom. The message concluded with a simple challenge that would echo through galactic history: come and take them. The words reached every human colony and every council command center. 3 simple words that summarized humanity's response to overwhelming force. They would not surrender, and they would not flee. They would stand and fight regardless of the consequences across human space. Military units took their final positions, while civilian populations moved to sheltered areas. Children were taught emergency procedures while their parents prepared weapons and defenses. Everyone understood that the next few days would determine whether humanity survived as a free species. The Council's enforcement fleets were already moving toward human space, led by War Commander Thexmore of the Zephyrian Directorate. His forces represented overwhelming technological superiority and had never been defeated in battle. However, they had never fought an enemy that preferred death to slavery. For the first time in 1,000 years, the galaxy was about to witness total war between civilizations. Advanced species watched with interest, while client races hoped secretly that the humans might achieve what no one thought possible. The balance of power that had existed for millennia was about to be tested. 24 hours remained before the first shots would be fired in a conflict that would reshape galactic civilization. Humanity had chosen war over surrender, and now They would discover whether determination could overcome superior force. The greatest test in human history was about to begin. War Commander Thex Moore of the Zephyrian Directorate led the Council's enforcement fleet with absolute confidence in his victory. His force of 2,000 vessels represented more firepower than most species had seen in their entire history. The ships moved through space using gravity manipulation technology that allowed them to travel faster than human minds could comprehend. Thex Moore had reviewed the intelligence reports about human military capabilities and found them laughably primitive. Human ships were slow metal constructions that relied on chemical propulsion and kinetic weapons. Their largest vessels were smaller than his escort fighters, and their weapons could barely damage Council defensive systems, the war commander expected the humans to surrender immediately upon seeing his fleet's true power. Every species in galactic history had made the same choice when faced with Council military superiority. A few token strikes would demonstrate the futility of resistance, and human leaders would quickly agree to relocation terms. However, Admiral Susan Clark's response to the Council ultimatum caught Thex Moore completely off guard. Her transmission was broadcast across all frequencies so that every ship in both fleets could hear it clearly. The message contained only 4 words, but they carried the weight of human determination. Come and take them. The first battle occurred at Outpost Defiance, where Captain Amy Foster commanded 12 converted cargo ships and 1 military frigate against 40 Council vessels. By every rational calculation, the engagement should have lasted less than 10 minutes with total human casualties and minimal Council losses. Foster's ships attacked using tactics that violated every principle of civilized warfare. They ignored targeting priorities and focused on ramming attacks against Council command vessels. Human fighters equipped with mining charges flew directly into enemy formations and detonated their explosives at point-blank range. The Council ships were technologically superior, but their crews had never faced opponents who treated their own lives as expendable weapons. Zephyrian commanders found themselves dealing with human vessels that continued attacking even after suffering critical damage. Some human ships kept fighting with dead crews, using automated systems programmed for suicide attacks. When the battle ended, 15 Council ships had been destroyed, and the survivors were forced to retreat for repairs. Captain Foster's entire fleet was gone, but they had achieved something that shocked the galaxy. For the first time in millennia, someone had made the Council bleed news of the impossible victory spread throughout both human space and the galactic community faster than official reports could travel. Independent traders and refugee ships carried word to species that had been oppressed by Council authority for thousands of years. The humans had proven that the Council could be hurt. War Commander Thex Moore was furious at the loss of 15 vessels to primitive human forces, but he made a critical error in judgment. He assumed that human success was due to luck rather than determination, and ordered his fleets to continue the advance without changing tactics. Meanwhile, human industrial capacity was exceeding all projections. The shipyards worked around the foe clock to replace losses, while weapons factories produced ammunition faster than it could be used. Dr. Kevin Murphy's engineering teams had perfected techniques for converting civilian equipment into military hardware. The second major engagement occurred at New Horizon, where Commander Tony Mitchell led a fleet of mining vessels against a Council supply convoy. Mitchell's ships were equipped with asteroid mining equipment that made excellent improvised weapons. Rock-cutting lasers became anti-ship beams, while ore processing systems were converted into projectile launchers. The ambush caught the Council forces completely unprepared for human tactics. Mining ships emerged from asteroid fields where Council sensors could not detect them and attacked the convoy using equipment designed for industrial rather than military purposes. The results were devastating. Mitchell's forces destroyed half the supply ships before retreating back into the asteroid belt, where Council vessels could not follow safely. The loss of supplies forced Council fleets to extend their logistics lines and reduce their operational effectiveness. Human guerrilla tactics were proving more successful than anyone had expected. The most shocking battle occurred at Freedom Point, where Colonel Sandra Lee's ground forces held off a crystalline hive invasion using tactics that horrified their opponents. The hive beings were accustomed to enemies that fought logically and retreated when facing superior force. Human soldiers continued fighting even when wounded and refused to surrender when their positions became hopeless. They used improvised explosives and booby traps that turned every building into a potential weapon. Some fighters detonated charges that killed themselves along with their enemies rather than accept defeat. The crystalline hive forces eventually captured Freedom Point, but they lost over 60% of their invasion force in the process. The cost was so high that other council species began questioning whether occupying human worlds was worth the casualties required. More importantly, other species throughout the galaxy were watching human resistance with growing interest. The Growlar. Republic quietly began providing supplies to human forces while maintaining official neutrality. The Keth Collective started organizing resistance cells in their own territory. The Kalar Resistance launched open rebellion in 3 sectors after seeing human success against Council forces. Species that had been client states for centuries suddenly began asserting their independence. The galaxy-wide order that had existed for millennia was starting to collapse. Admiral Clark coordinated human resistance efforts from her command center on Earth, while Jake Morrison led mobile fleets that struck Council forces throughout the outer colonies. Their tactics emphasized speed and unpredictability over direct confrontation. Human forces would attack quickly, then disappear before Council reinforcements could arrive. Each human victory came at enormous cost in ships and lives, but they achieved something that no species had accomplished in galactic history. They made the Council's military commanders doubt their own invincibility. Fear began spreading through Council ranks as officers realized they were fighting an enemy that could not be intimidated. Dr. Helen Ross made a breakthrough when her research team discovered weaknesses in Council communication systems. Human electronics could jam the exotic frequencies that Council ships used to coordinate their fleets. Disrupting these signals left individual vessels isolated and vulnerable. The jamming technology was quickly distributed to human forces throughout the colonies. Ships that had been hopelessly outgunned could now isolate and destroy Council vessels by cutting them off from fleet support. The technological advantage that had seemed insurmountable was starting to narrow. War Commander Thex Moore found himself facing a crisis that challenged everything he understood about warfare. His forces were suffering casualties at rates that exceeded all projections while human resistance continued to strengthen. The primitive species was fighting with a determination that defied rational analysis. The Council began receiving reports of rebellion and unrest throughout their territory as other species were inspired by human example. The enforcement operation that was supposed to end quickly was turning into a prolonged conflict that threatened the stability of galactic civilization. After 6 months of brutal warfare, the situation reached a critical turning point. Council forces controlled most human colonies, but at a cost that was becoming unsustainable. Human guerrilla forces continued operating from hidden bases, while their industrial capacity somehow continued producing weapons and ships. More seriously for the Council, other species were beginning to challenge their authority openly. The galactic order that had maintained peace for 10,000 years was fracturing, as client races demanded the same freedom that humans were fighting to preserve. Hierarch Zexathara called an emergency session of the Council to address the crisis. For the first time in millennia, the absolute rulers of the galaxy faced the possibility that their authority could be successfully challenged by determined resistance. The war that was supposed to end human independence had instead inspired a galaxy-wide rebellion that threatened to destroy everything the Council had built. The emergency council session convened in the same crystal chamber where humanity had first been condemned to relocation. However, the atmosphere was completely different from that earlier meeting. For the first time in 10,000 years, the absolute rulers of the galaxy faced a crisis that threatened their very existence. Hierarch Zexathera stood before his fellow council members with reports that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Human resistance had not collapsed despite suffering massive casualties. Instead, it had inspired rebellion across dozens of star systems as other species demanded the same freedom that humans were fighting to preserve. War Commander Thexmore transmitted his latest casualty reports with barely controlled anger. Council. Forces had lost over 800 vessels in the past month alone, while human industrial capacity somehow continued producing replacement ships. The enforcement operation was consuming resources at rates that threatened other Council military commitments. More troubling were the intelligence reports about spreading rebellion. The Kalar resistance had openly declared independence and was attacking Council installations throughout 3 sectors. The Grolar Republic had withdrawn from several treaty obligations and was providing covert support to human forces. Even client species that had been loyal for centuries were beginning to question Council authority. The Aquatic Collective had refused to provide troops for the human war. The Silicon Commonwealth was demanding renegotiation of their tribute agreements. The galaxy-wide order was fracturing Prime Node 7 of the crystalline hive, analyzed the situation with cold mathematical precision. The cost of occupying human space exceeded the benefits by any rational calculation. Council forces could eventually win through sheer attrition, but the victory would be meaningless if it triggered total galactic war. The Hive representative displayed tactical analyses showing that human resistance was fundamentally different from anything the Council had faced before. Other species fought to preserve their existing civilization, but humans fought as if they preferred extinction to surrender. This psychological factor made conventional military doctrine ineffective. Thexmore argued for escalating the war by targeting human civilian populations directly. He believed that threatening Earth itself would force human leaders to negotiate. However, other Council members recognized that such tactics would only strengthen resistance while providing propaganda for rebel movements. The debate continued for hours as Council members struggled with a problem that their civilization was not designed to handle. They had maintained power through overwhelming technological superiority and the assumption that rational beings would always choose survival over destruction. However, humans were proving that some things were valued more than life itself. Their willingness to accept massive casualties for abstract concepts like freedom and independence was incomprehensible to species that had achieved stability through submission to authority. The decisive moment came when intelligence reports arrived about the Battle of Sol. War Commander Thexmore had finally decided to attack Earth directly, hoping to end human resistance by destroying their homeworld. Admiral Susan Clark had marshaled every available human ship for a final desperate defense. The battle raged across the solar system for 3 days, as human forces supported by volunteers and weapons from a dozen non-Council species fought with unprecedented ferocity. Ships commanded by officers who had never expected to survive the war threw themselves against Council vessels with tactics that defied all military logic. Captain Jake Morrison led the final assault against Thexmore's command ship in his badly damaged vessel, the Phoenix. The human ship had lost most of its weapons and life support systems, but Morrison continued his attack run even as his bridge filled with smoke and his crew died around him. The ramming attack that destroyed the Council flagship also killed Morrison and his entire crew, but it broke the Council fleet's command structure. Without central coordination, the surviving ships retreated in confusion while human forces pressed their advantage. The impossible had happened again. News of the Council defeat at humanity's homeworld spread throughout the galaxy within hours. Species that had been subjects for millennia suddenly saw that their rulers could be beaten by determined resistance. Rebellions erupted in systems that had been peaceful for centuries. Faced with the collapse of galactic order, the Council made a decision that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the conflict. They requested negotiations with human representatives. The absolute rulers of the galaxy were asking to speak with the primitive species they had tried to relocate. Ambassador Lisa Bell found herself in the unprecedented position of negotiating, from strength rather than desperation. The woman who had once begged for human survival now held the power to reshape galactic civilization. The war had changed everything, including humanity's position in the galaxy. The negotiations took place aboard a neutral vessel provided by the Kalar Resistance. Bell sat across from Hierarch Zex Thara and demanded recognition of human sovereignty over all their existing colonies. She also insisted that the Council establish representation for non-Council species in galactic government. Zex Thara agreed to both demands with reluctance that bordered on despair. The alternative was continued war that would destroy the civilization his species had spent millennia building. The Council would maintain their power, but they would no longer have absolute authority. The resulting treaty fundamentally changed galactic politics in ways that satisfied no one completely but prevented total destruction. Humanity received full recognition as an independent power with sovereignty over their colonies. The forced relocation order was formally withdrawn. More importantly, the treaty established the Galactic Assembly where non-Council species could have representation in galactic government. The absolute rule of the 12 species was replaced by a system that gave voice to hundreds of previously powerless civilizations. The war officially ended with massive celebrations across human space, but also with the sobering knowledge of what victory had cost. Nearly half of humanity's fleet was gone, and millions of people had died defending freedom. Entire colonies had been destroyed and would take decades to rebuild. However, humans had achieved something that no species in galactic history had accomplished. They had fought the absolute rulers of the galaxy to a standstill and forced them to negotiate as equals. The price had been enormous, but the principle was established. As Reconstruction began, Dr. Helen Ross observed that humanity had not won because they were stronger or smarter than other species. They had succeeded because they were willing to pay a price that others were not. Freedom had been purchased with blood and sacrifice. The Council retained significant power and influence, but they no longer ruled through fear alone. Other species had learned that resistance was possible and that determined opposition could achieve results that negotiation could not. In the Outer Rim, human colonies began expanding again, but now they were joined by refugees from dozens of species, seeking the freedom that humanity had fought to protect. The galaxy would never return to the old order of absolute council authority. Jake Morrison was posthumously promoted to admiral and became a symbol of human sacrifice for principle. His final attack had broken more than just a council flagship. It had shattered the assumption that superior technology always defeated superior determination. The war between the Council and humanity lasted only 8 months, but its effects would reshape galactic civilization for centuries to come. The 12 species still had power, but they no longer had the absolute authority they had wielded for 10 millennia. Humanity had proven that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. Their example would inspire other species to demand representation, dignity, and freedom from the powers that had ruled them without consent. The galaxy had learned a lesson that would echo through history. Technology and military might could impose order, but they could not create lasting peace without the consent of the governed. The age of absolute rule was ending, and the age of galactic democracy was beginning. In the end, the Council had possessed overwhelming power. But humanity had something more valuable. They had the resolve to use their freedom responsibly and the courage to fight for principles that transcended individual survival. The galaxy would be forever changed by their example.